Welcome to the Software People Stories. I'm Shiv.
I'm Chitra.
And I'm Gayatri.
We bring you interesting, untold stories of people
Associated with the creation
or consumption of software-based solutions.
You'll hear stories of what worked
and sometimes what didn't.
You will also hear very personal experiences
and insights that would trigger your thoughts
and inspire you to do even greater things.
In this episode, I am in conversation with Andy Hillard, the CEO of Accelerance. He leads and advocates for the globalization and collaboration of great software teams across the world. In this conversation, Andy covers his extensive career journey, including his time with the Peace Corps, his experience in finance and marketing, and his transition into software development. Andy discusses the evolution of the outsourcing industry, emphasizing the need for service providers to build trust and credibility with their clients. He shares insights on fostering empathy and collaboration with distributed teams, particularly in the context of outsourcing relationships. And he also highlights the importance of aligning cultural values, communication practices, and leadership styles between clients and service providers to ensure successful collaboration. And he also touches upon the challenges and controversies in outsourcing, and that led to a short discussion on the risks and benefits of outsourcing arrangements involving multiple service providers. Overall, in this episode, you'll get to hear the strategies for building effective and trustworthy partnerships in the software development industry. Listen on. Hi, Andy. Welcome to the Software People Stories.
Hi, Shiv. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I think you are probably one of my unique guests in the sense that you've been on both sides of software development, both on providing services as well as helping organizations work with other service providers. So I know a lot of questions that I have, but before I get ahead of myself, if you can start with a brief introduction and your career trajectory, and we'll take it from there.
All right, I'll just quickly summarize it. So I grew up in Northern California, which is actually where I am right now. I left Sonoma, California, which is wine country, about 45 minutes north of San Francisco, right next to Napa Valley. It's Sonoma Valley. And I left there in 1977, returned in 2019. So yes, you can do the math, and I'm relatively old. I left to pursue college and to play ice hockey on the East Coast, and then ultimately in college. My undergraduate degree was in finance and marketing and international business. Then after college, I spent about 4 years essentially in a cubicle in financial services in a bank, which by all means, that is a great career for some people, depending on their personalities. It really wasn't a great trajectory for me. I just felt that I lived in a bubble in Denver, Colorado at the time. And, I lived Monday through Friday in order to get to the weekend. And I, was just in such a routine. I just thought, life has to be much bigger and grander than that. I was actually skiing one weekend with a friend of mine, and he said I should join the Peace Corps. And for the listeners who do or do not know, what the Peace Corps is, it's a U.S. governmental organization, which there are about 12,000 to 15,000 United States Peace Corps volunteers that go to developing countries. They bring specific skill sets, and they spend 3 years in those countries, in a community, helping that community with their specific skill set. Mine was micro enterprise development, working with small businesses, specifically fisheries and ceramic associations. And so I lived there for 3 years. This was in Costa Rica, by the way. I left the Peace Corps and went directly to Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management, where I was also a finance and international business major. And Kellogg is known for marketing primarily and consumer packaged goods. Of course, they also graduate consultants and engineers and manufacturing MBAs, but it's really well known as the number one marketing school in the nation as far as the MBAs are concerned. So, of course, all the large brands come to Kellogg to recruit. I was recruited by Nestle. I became their West Coast product manager for two water brands. And this was essentially early 90s, right? It's still, the internet was in its infancy or embryonic, frankly, not really commercialized. Um, and so I spent about 3 years there. And then, I like to joke that Al Gore invented the internet, which which obviously he did. But I joined a small company called Cognizant. So in 1996, Cognizant spun out of Dun& Bradstreet. They were an internal software development organization serving, internal constituents and lines of business. And, at the time, there was such a massive demand for software development, creating digital, software to drive internal and external, commercial enterprises. And I just thought that this was the future. It's international, it's business. My love for travel, my fascination with different cultures. So I became one of their first divisional managers in the Southeast US. So when I joined Cognizant, there were 700 people. I think today they're maybe 240, 260,000, right? And there were 700 people, of which probably 650 were IIT graduates in Chennai and Bangalore primarily. So I spent the next 3 years at Cognizant. They grew from 700 to 20,000 software engineers. And whereas when I started out, they were essentially signing any client they could get their hand on. They just needed stories, they needed logos, they needed presence because they were far behind the Wipros, Infosys's of the world. They were trying to make their mark in the world. And having grown so quickly in such a short period of time, they essentially said, look, any client that cannot deliver, 200 software engineers from day one and can't scale to over 1,000 engineers, we really want to not declassify them, but deprioritize them in terms of importance to the company. And I just really had an epiphany at that time. I said, the world is going digital. E-commerce is for everyone, but always the rich get richer. And what about the small and mid-cap companies? How can they get access to the best talent? Like, some of my clients were Wells Fargo and Bank of America. Well, of course, that they can hire thousands of engineers, and they could actually put, contingencies of their own employees over in India to oversee and manage that. And it was very nice and convenient that they're getting the best graduates and the best service providers and the best tension and all of that. So I said, there's got to be a model. I mean, the world's full of smart people. So there has to be a model that can be like small Cognizants that were what I coined at the time, large enough to scale, but small enough to care. These companies that were essentially diamonds in the rough. They had the same business leadership, thought leadership, practice leadership, commitment to process, maybe CMMI level 3, 4, 5. But the world did not know they existed. The world only knew that, rich, powerful tier one service providers who occupied everyone's mind and Google and SEO and advertising and everything were about the only options for them. Otherwise, there were no options. There were no platforms to find intelligent developers. There were no platforms to hire or engage contractors around the world. So, my trajectory, I left Cognizant and I went back to Costa Rica to start a nearshore software services company back in 2003. One aside. So, during the time between my MBA class and 2003, and I was a big consumer of globalization, being an international business major. So like Michael Porter's Competitive Advantage of Nations, Thomas Friedman's The World is Flat. This was all talking about, distributing work around the world to locations that had hyper specialized talent or a pool of talent that was unique under that region or that country.
Mhm.
So I really took that same philosophy with me to Costa Rica, saying that there are companies in the US that cannot do follow the sun development. They don't have the experience. They
Mhm.
don't have the knowledge. They don't have the personnel to put over around the world. So, I spent the next 4 years building a company in Costa Rica from 0 to 300 software engineers. I just thought that this model, my large enough to scale, small enough to care company with thought, practice, and business leadership was a model that needed to be created, a business model that needed to be created. So I started traveling the world looking for and assessing companies like my company, like a mini Cognizant, and finding all what I call the mini Cognizants of the world and creating a global network to serve small and mid-cap companies. That's basically a long summary of a short summary.
Yeah, very interesting. Um, the things that you mentioned about being with the Peace Corps and then working with communities to solve their challenges and so on. And then when you decided to start up, having seen, say, the requirements of large companies, and like you said, many companies which are small, which don't scale, which don't get under the radar. When you built the team, how did or what was your magic of creating the empathy in the team members to think beyond probably their local requirements or the local ways of working, etc., and be kind of accepted globally?
Well, okay, so I'm gonna break this into a couple of pieces. So if you're talking about the client, how do I get the client to start thinking empathetically or as
No,
a
no,
servant
no,
leader or
no, no, about the team. You said you built the team about 300, right?
yes.
So these were all, I assume, people who were in Costa Rica, who grew up in Costa Rica, who were working in Costa Rica, etc.
Mm,
Now, their ways of working and probably what Wells Fargo needed, whether it is in terms of the process orientation or even the empathy for their customers. Uh,
yeah, exactly. So, um, one indigenous advantage that I knew that Costa Rica or Latin America has is not only is a time zone aligned. So there is no you're already there are already cultural differences and proximity differences. It's offshore
mhm,
and it's not the American culture, but the Latin culture is actually very similar to the American culture in terms of how they process information, how they solve problems, how they communicate. There's a much cleaner and more correlated communication structure. So that was an inbred advantage to Latin America. Also, what I had mentioned before is that for small and mid-sized companies, it's very difficult to coordinate and to communicate in bits and pieces. And the software is really a team sport. You have different functions, you have different people in a Scrum team, you have a hierarchy. You need a lot of coordination, a lot of synergy, which is part of the title of the book. And you need a lot of small and mid-sized businesses need more of a sense of control and involvement. It's not a
mhm,
throw it over the fence type of
mhm.
activity, at least done right. You
Yeah.
can do it if you have a very, in the old days, a fixed price waterfall project, where you just needed very little interaction and you were essentially hiring a company to just build a product. Our model was not about that. Our model was about creating extensions
Mhm,
of a company's software development organization. Essentially there's a degree of embeddedness or integration between the two.
mhm,
So that obviously means, combining that and the concept of team sports, that needs that people need to be communicating frequently,
mhm,
often, uh, empathetically, building trust, coordination, being accountable. Not to say that, any other service provider isn't accountable, but these are the foundations of creating a relationship where people can trust one another and hold each other accountable. And
Mhm.
so I really emphasize that take advantage of the time zone overlap. Take advantage of the
Mhm.
time you're communicating, over communicate,
Mhm.
ask clarifying questions, which, comes most very naturally. Um, Whereas I think, mostly in Asia, it's more of it's historically been more of an order taking kind of
Right.
dialogue between the two, and typically the answers is yes in a way,
Mhm.
and then you go figure it out, behind the scenes, because that's the best way that that general culture serves the American market, and it's been performed very well over many decades, and it's just the way the culture is. So I just really, when I was building my company in Costa Rica, I wanted to emphasize the people that we hired, that we tested, that we brought on, that this was a fully integrated relationship where it required that I also taught the client themselves on
Mhm.
how to interact. Don't expect, because Americans are very transactional, and frankly they're very litigious. So they think outsourcing. Well, outsourcing, I want to just send requirements. I don't want to interact. I want to get back, my results, and then I will judge them and determine whether I pay or not, based on that. But our biggest emphasis today is not so much, we know our partners are good at hiring, empathetic, communicative, people that want to become a part of the client's environment and communicate and work that way. More of the emphasis today is really on teaching clients on how to build highly effective teams when the service provider wants to be a certain way, and the client really needs to be more of a servant leader in leaning into the service provider's desire to work so closely.
Yeah, I think that's a very nice way of looking at it. And you also refer to the five dysfunctions in your book. Uh,
Yeah, that's a value of our company, and that's also a value of our consulting.
hmm. But when you do that, particularly for either distributed teams or hybrid teams, now how do you bring in the basis, which is the vulnerability-based trust?
Well, first off, we hire for that, we test for that,
Okay.
and we retain for that.
Mhm.
So these are values that we want to see present in the service providers that we partner with. And then we want to see it demonstrated in their onboarding and alignment process with clients.
Mhm.
And we want to see it demonstrated and reported back to us, both from the client and the service provider, in terms of that the relationship is continually improving, that there is a lot of interaction. So, for example, one of the things that clients often are both curious and incredulous sometimes about is the fact that we want them to travel. Frankly, multiple times, and multiple teams travel in the due diligence process
Mhm.
to understand and appreciate the culture,
Mhm.
the partner, and to break bread and build relationships that are not software development related. So, I like to say that 50% of the time it's around the requirements and the standards and the metrics and the processes that you'll deploy during your relationship. But the other 50% of the time is hiking, dining, seeing places or areas that the service provider is proud of that represents their country. That's actually comes completely from the Peace Corps. I mean, the Peace Corps, they have three values, and the third value is the one of knowledge transfer. The first two values is one, an understanding and appreciation of your host country nationals' culture, how they live life, how they process, how they prioritize things, what's important to them. The second value is to share and gain appreciation of the culture that I, as a volunteer, bring to that host country national, so they understand me as a person. For example, when I was in Costa Rica, there was an initial um, perception that I was a spy or a government agent or a
Mhm.
CIA agent, because actually at that period in Central America, the Contras and the Sandinistas, communism versus democracy, and Costa Rica was a bastion of democracy, and they just assumed that I was a CIA operative undercover, and in fact, I'm like, well, if you think I'm a CIA operative, this CIA operative is going to live with you and going to eat with you and going to go to church with you and going to attend local events with you for the next 3 years. And then I'll slowly change your mind. I'm not just here and then gone. I'm here, to share this environment with you and to work with you. And you'll gain trust with me over time.
Yeah, so that's an interesting model. But then if it took 3 years to build that trust, in an outsourcing arrangement, you need to kind of accelerate that, right? Is that why the
You
name
definitely need
Accelerance?
Yes, absolutely. It's accelerating the process to get from, I guess, credibility and selection to trust. And then, with trust comes radical candor and commitment and accountability and such. Right. So, that, and I'm not saying that it took 3 years. It was like, 3 years passes. Now I trust you. I didn't trust you in 2 years and 11 months, but I trust you in 3 years. So, I mean, trust is built through action. And, you say what you say, you are who you are, and your actions speak louder than words. So, in my case, it was just, getting up, being very visible, and doing the work that I was, there to do, and asking for feedback, and then doing, a lot of natural, subtle things, I guess, that build that trust over time. Just, being very common, you know.
So another aspiration, so to say, of many of these service providers is to move from, like you mentioned, an order taker to being a thought partner or probably a partner of sorts. So, what, from your experience, should, again, like you said, it is a team sport, should the players be aware of, or how can they prepare themselves to also, extend their hand and become trustworthy?
Well, wow, there's a few things here. So, for example, yesterday I met with a partner from Vietnam, and they aspire to those exact things that you described, and they have visions of going from 500 people to an IPO in 2030. But they are new to the U.S. market. 40% of their market's in Japan. 40% is in like Singapore and Malaysia, and the other 20% is like domestic. 10% is in America. So we're 10% out of that. And they want to grow to 50, 60, 70%. I'm thinking like old Cognizant so they've done a couple of things that have helped them. One is to establish a physical presence on the West Coast. And they're going to send another person here in the U.S., maybe to Denver or New York here this year. So that's good. Physicality, meeting people, again, breaking bread with them. More so than that, though, a lot of service providers come to me and say, hey, we have physical presence in the U.S., but it's typically like a sales or marketing person. And it's, that's where the credibility and trust. I mean, essentially, as a vendor of anything, you immediately enter a trust deficit. You enter a chasm, and your job is to get out of that chasm as quickly and fast as possible. And that is largely contingent on credibility. Like I said before, I come to Costa Rica as a Peace Corps volunteer. I bring certain skills that they don't have. I demonstrate those skills. I show those skills. And then it's about doing what I said I was going to do, show up every day. 90% of success is showing up, the old phrase or something like that. So it's the same with anything. And with this service provider, I say, well, physical presence is good. But that presence has to have credibility and it has to have leadership. When we vet service providers, we always vet them for a breadth and depth of business, practice, thought, leadership. There can't be just a sort of a Wizard of Oz, who's behind the curtain person that is fronting everything. You have to demonstrate that, one of the easiest hacks in selecting a service provider is smart people hire smart people. So if you have a layer and a thickness of smart people, they're not going to sit around and just hire a bunch of, robots and lower cost, low level people, because smart people cannot stand that type of environment. They will leave. It will collapse. So that's one signal to anyone. But also domestically, if you're domestic, you need to have, consultative practice leadership so that people will get to meet. They'll build credibility. They'll build a relationship. They are doing things that AI can't do, or a salesperson or marketing person can't do. There's tangible things there that are unique to being present and having credibility and showing up. And I keep on, harping on these things. And it may sound simple or sort of elementary, but it's things that either companies won't do or can't do or don't choose to do. And that's their downfall. They are going to be seen as a commoditized, well, sometimes they'll somehow win things. If they throw their hook in the water enough, they'll catch some fish. But those fish are going to not be there very often. I mean, if you go in and you win a deal because you're remote and you say you're the lowest cost, better, faster, cheaper, and you win a deal, that is going to be the shortest honeymoon ever. That relationship is going to not see, longevity. What we're trying to build is long-term relationships. And if you have physical, credible presence and you have a depth of presence and you demonstrate that, you're going to provide the glue to, creating this long-term relationship with credibility and trust.
I don't know if this is a right case. Then you probably heard about this the scandal or the controversy between the UK post office and Fujitsu.
No, tell me. I'm not sure. I haven't heard
Okay.
that.
Yeah, sometime back. Right? Yeah, the UK Postal Service had outsourced pretty much their core operations to Fujitsu. I'm mentioning names because it's out in the papers and all that. And there was some error in the the back-end calculations, which resulted in a lot of people getting fired because the system said that these people were committing fraud. But then it was actually a problem with the accounting, the software that was doing all that. So the case went on for many years. And then finally, the courts said that, yeah, Fujitsu is at fault. But then so many careers were affected and all these things happened. And so there was a lot of discussion on whether even outsourcing should be considered, whether everything should be done in-house. Yeah, so when something like that happens, a major, probably somebody didn't do the proper due diligence in terms of specifications or acceptance or wherever it happened. Many large companies I've seen working with multiple service providers. Someone who does the software development, somebody else who does the integration, and then probably a third one who does the IB&B type of activities. And somewhere between the cracks, something just falls through, and ultimately there is an impact. So the model that you are recommending about creating more cohesive teams and all that, how can that be scaled to include teams from multiple organizations? I asked Andy about creating more cohesive teams that can be scaled to include teams from multiple organizations. The answer to that question and a lot more in the next episode. Don't miss it.
We thank Siddharth for the music and Anita for promoting the Software People Stories.
If you like this episode,
Please subscribe on your favorite podcast client.
And spread the word in your network.
if you'd like to share your story,
Contact us at podcasts@pm-powerconsulting.com.